Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Lord, help us if it were only quite so easy. Please sit. Please stop before someone gets hurt. I hear my grandmother calling from upstairs. This was probably a more frequent refrain in my home than I would care to admit, as my sibling and I are engaging in some manner of horseplay downstairs, and we would hear from our grandmother upstairs, "Please stop before someone gets hurt." A cry that rarely was heeded. I found that then later in life as a parent, uttering that same cry to my own children down the stairs, "Please stop before someone gets hurt," it was never heeded as well. As a teacher, calling after my students, as a priest, "Please stop before someone gets hurt." A cry that is essentially what I hear the prophets throughout the Holy Scriptures saying to God's people again and again, "Please stop. Please stop before someone gets hurt," trying to draw us back into a closer connection with God when we had strayed away a little too far. Incidentally, if you've ever wondered about the incarnation and why Jesus at that particular time in that particular place, why God comes incarnate among us, I'll tell you now, this is at least part of how I make sense of it. Much like the parent that had been calling down the stairs time and time again, "Please stop before someone gets hurt," and was ignored again and again and again, and eventually Grandma has to come downstairs and set things right. Much in that same way, prophet after prophet for generation had been calling out to us, and I like to think that it was finally God saying, "All right, I'm coming down there myself to put things in order." I think this is at least in part of what's happening in the incarnation. Now, one of those prophets is the prophet Micah. One such person who, in the 8th century BC, during the reign of kings Ahaz and Hezekiah, the northern and southern kingdoms had split, but largely were still in agreement about the fundamentals that all the law and the prophets hang on. That we are called to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. And yet, time and time again, it came to pass where for one reason or another we were failing to love our neighbors as people with power and authority continued to grow more power and more authority, and those who were sick or ill or foreigners, or people of a different language or a nation found themselves continuing to struggle. And prophets like the prophet Micah would come out and speak truth to power, would come out and not afraid to speak truth to power to those who held that power, and to say, "You're not loving your neighbors as yourself, and it's going to lead to disaster. It will be bad for you." Unafraid to speak truth to power when there could have been real consequences for it. To stand up against those in authority when it could have been silenced or hurt or tortured or killed for it. Micah, unafraid to go out and say, "You're called to love your neighbors as yourself." This in a time when I think most people, I want to say, probably believed in the idea of loving their neighbors as themselves. I think the deeper problem was there's a loophole. There's a loophole that we can grab onto and pass through. And that loophole is if we can classify someone as not our neighbor. If we can say, well, that person, that widow or that orphan, that child, they're not really our neighbor, so we don't have to love them. That person who's from a foreign land, they're not really our neighbor. We don't have to love them. that person of a different language or of a different faith or disagrees with me about something, they don't count as my neighbor. I don't have to love them. That's the loophole. And Micah would not stand for it. Micah was the one walking into the temple, pointing his finger and saying, "You are not loving your neighbors as yourselves." God does not want your sacrifices. God doesn't want your gifts at the altar. God doesn't want you going through the motions to make God happy. God wants you to love your neighbors as yourself. And my reaction is to say, right on, Micah. You go get them. Don't let them off the hook for it, Micah. Stay at it until they change their ways. Micah, our champion. Until I imagine, then it's 2026, and Micah comes walking through the doors up here, pointing his finger at us, pointing the finger at me and saying, "Love your neighbor as yourself, Stephen." And I go, "But Micah, it's complicated." Clearly, it wasn't complicated for folks back then where they had the easy choice between clearly right and clearly wrong, and were choosing wrong. You need to understand, Micah, it's complicated. We live in a world right now where we can look at people in Israel and say, it makes sense that you're trying to go to war to try to protect your fellow citizens, to keep them safe from harm, and you're doing that to love your neighbor. But we also see people in Gaza who for generations upon generations had been subjected to inhumane treatment, and supporting organizations like Hamas trying to stand up and love their neighbors. It's complicated, Micah, to look at a world where for some of us the best way we can love our neighbor is to arm ourselves, to be a card-carrying member of the NRA, Second Amendment's right supporter, to carry a firearm in order to love our neighbor as ourselves, while another person believes that every weapon in this country should be melted down to slag in order to love our neighbor. It's complicated, Micah. When one person firmly believes the best way to love your neighbor is to defend the life of an unborn child, and another person believes the best way to love your neighbor is to stand up for the reproductive rights of a woman with human dignity, it's complicated. And so what do we do when, on the one hand, our choice can be to say, I want to love our neighbors by closing off our borders and saying no one who is not one of us belongs in this place in order to love my neighbor. And another person says, but letting those in from another land who are fleeing persecution, who are looking for a better life, who are looking for some human dignity, deserve to have that in order to love our neighbor. And I'm going to assume, I think in good faith, I can assume that everyone gathered in this room today, we all believe that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. I think we all agree about that. I would say that pretty much every person gathering in a house of worship anywhere in the world today believes in that. I would say that for the most part in our nation, virtually every person in our nation believes we should love our neighbors as ourselves. But it's complicated, Micah. And he gives us some advice, though, about how we can try to go about that work of discerning what is the right course of action in any moment. And he tells us 3 things, I think 2 of which really don't help us that much, and 1 of which I hope helps us a little bit. Because when he points to those in power and it compels them to love their neighbors, he says how to do it. He says you go out and you seek justice. You love mercy. You walk humbly with God. Now, seeking justice is essentially about holding accountability in this world. Holding people and nations, holding us and others accountable in this world as an act of loving our neighbors. Mercy, on the other hand, is in many ways, the opposite of that. It's about not holding someone accountable when you had the opportunity to. It's about looking at a moment and saying, now is not the time to hold this person accountable. And so we still find ourselves faced with conundrums of Do we take somebody who is here that is in our nation illegally, who entered unlawfully, and to say, well, justice says that we should remove them because that's holding people accountable for their actions, and that's how we love our neighbors, those of us who are here lawfully. When mercy, seeking mercy, loving mercy is telling us that, but we have a duty to those who are here among us in danger, seeking help, seeking solace, seeking sanctuary, just looking to be allowed to be a human being, and it's not the time here for accountability. And one of the great tragedies, I think part of what tears us so apart as a nation is this false idea that some of us are in favor of justice and mercy and some of us are against justice and mercy, when far more often the problem we face as a nation is we all want justice. We all want to be merciful. And it's great when they're aligned, but so often the just thing to do and the merciful thing to do may be at odds. And how are we to discern when it's the time for justice, when it's the time for mercy? That's the kind of grief I hear tearing at so many of us in this world, wanting to look out and see that there's so many lost opportunities for justice in this world. There's so many lost opportunities for mercy in this world, and it hurts our souls. We want to know what to do about it. Now, it's in that place that I think we can find some hope in Micah's third point, which is walk humbly with our God, which is just to realize that none of us are experts at this. We all have some learning to do. We all have some growing to do. In a complicated world, when we are doing the best we can to try to weigh when is it time for justice and when is it time for mercy, there's really only one that is an expert in knowing when it's time for one and the other, and that's God. The rest of us are just amateurs. And so, in humility, we need to stay together, be in conversation with one another, to seek to learn together, to be prayerful with one another, to try to discern the best course of action in any moment, realizing we're not alone in doing that. That's part of what the humility will teach us, is let us prayerfully walk with God as we try to figure this out together. Now, at the end of the annual meeting last week, I had multiple people come up to us and say, I want to know how I can be involved. I want to be a part of helping this world be a more just and merciful place in all of its complexity. I want to be a part of loving our neighbors in all of its complexity. And I am absolutely here for that. So for anyone who is either at the annual meeting or here today, or if it's just been in your heart for some time and a yearning to want to be a part of helping, I'm here for that. Reach out, let me know, because you can be a part of it with us here at St. James. St. James Cathedral and the Diocese of Chicago, we are a member organization of ICER, that's the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, where we actively are engaging in the work, working with the ACLU, working with law enforcement agencies, trying to figure out what is the best way in any moment to take care of the people around us in a way that upholds the First Amendment, in a way that upholds the Fourth Amendment, in a way that upholds human dignity for those who are most vulnerable around us. I welcome you to be a part of that conversation with us. St. James Cathedral, we are a member of the joint committee of the Diocese's Sanctuary Committee and the Peace and Justice Committee and the Anti-Racism Commission and the Hispanic Affairs Committee, jointly getting together and organizing about how can we best lift up human dignity where it's needed most in our spaces. We get together every Saturday at 9 a.m. On Zoom. We have a whole gathering at 9 a.m. on Zoom. If you are interested in knowing more about what you can do here in our city, let me know. And then we talk throughout the whole week. where we organize plans, because sometimes the right thing to do in this right moment is to look at how can we feed someone. How can we feed somebody whose primary breadwinner has been taken from their homes and we have someone who's in need? How can we protect those who are trying to travel to their doctor and get there safely and return home safely? How can we be the best churches we can be in this moment? We here at St. James, we drafted the protocols here for how church personnel, church members, ushers, greeters, sextons, clergy can engage with law enforcement at our churches. We drafted that here. It's actually now being used across the Diocese of Chicago. It's actually now being used in Philadelphia, in the Diocese of Pennsylvania, and in the Diocese of Minnesota. And that came from here. That came from St. James. If you have an eagerness in your heart, if you're hearing the call in the Beatitudes, if you hunger for justice and righteousness, if you thirst for righteousness, if you want to approach it with humility and prayerfulness, if you're feeling aggrieved and looking to know what to do with that, we have a place for you here. We can find how you can be engaged. And to remember that those Beatitudes, those didn't start with Jesus. Jesus was saying the same things that were coming from prophet upon prophet for generations before him. When he called out to each and every one of you, each and every one of us, to say, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus wasn't the first to say that. When he picked up a young child or a foreigner or a sinner or someone who was the most neglected around us and said, the way you love this person is the way you love me, he was carrying on a tradition of prophet upon prophet for generations who have been calling out to us. And that's a call for us here today that still rings true. And so, yes, we're hearing the call of the prophet Micah on this time to seek justice, to love mercy. And what will help us do that is walking humbly with our God. But we remember the day is coming someday when Grandma is coming down the stairs. Jesus someday is going to come down among us and say, I am here to make things right. And we want to be, in good faith, able to say, we've heard that call. And we together have been discerning how can we love our neighbors as ourselves the best we can in this moment. Thanks be to God. Amen.